Okay, our next panelist is Dr. Gereon Kopf, a professor at the Luther College, whose expertise lies in East Asia religion and philosophy religion. And his title is AI, Sentience, and Buddha's Mind, a fourth approach, a personal approach. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Kopf.
Good morning, Chawan. And I would like to thank Venerable Ifa and Woodenfish and all the organizers to facilitating such a wonderful conference. And I also would like actually to thank the people who made the schedule for putting me at the place, because I think that I can feed right in with the presentations from yesterday and earlier today. So what I would like to do today is to introduce a new approach to studying consciousness. And the topic given is AI, and here is from Astro Boy, a famous manga anime from the 50s and 60s by Tezuka Osamu, in which he explores issues that may arise, ethical issues, if it's possible to do a fully functioning organic humanoid. So what I would like to talk about today is how to study the mind. Mind studies, as many people before me said, present company included, is that with minds studying the mind. And when we talk, we've heard a lot talking about when using the language of first and third person approaches when we talk about consciousness. And I think that the language of first and third person approach is trapped in linguistics and Anglophone language. And so I would like to expand our methodological tools by adding, as contemplative studies people did, a second person, but then today I would like to add a fourth person approach. And for that, I think I would like to take a deep dive into Buddhist philosophy. As Evan Thompson said in his book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, is that what we can learn from Buddhism, if we want to engage with cognitive science, we should look at Buddhist philosophy rather than mindfulness practices. So what I would like to approach is a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift that has been suggested by Varela and Thompson in their Embodied Mind, by Yasuo Yuasa in his work that has been translated by Nagatomo. It has also been completely different ways suggested by Marjorie Bullicoat and Chuntani, who proposes neuro-robotics, but he actually uses phenomenology to do so. So in order to do that, I would like to actually look at East Asian Buddhist philosophy. And before I do that, I want to add two disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that I will not look at HRI, human-robot interaction, but actually I will look at what I call AAI. It has nothing to do with AI, actually. Agent interactions. And because, as has been said by Evan Thompson, by Robert Scharf, and Georg Nordhoff, is that I'm also skeptical that AI has, in the present form, as consciousness. To do that, we would need an embodied, if not an organic AI. The second disclaimer is my method of reading East Asian Buddhist texts is influenced actually by Dogen and Nishida, the people that I've studied, is that it's a creative misreading of texts that we decontextualize and then recontextualize And I do that because I want to introduce a new way of thinking, that fourth person paradigm. So if we study minds, if minds study minds, we are immediately in the problem of other minds. And if we look at the problem of other minds, the problem is, if you want to use the language of David Chalmers, it's the harder problem, not only the hard problem. And so I would like to look at Koyama Iwao. He talks about antiphony, and he says the problem is if you have two eyes communicate, they don't communicate. It's actually a cacophony. So in order to have a relationship, to have an interaction between two agents, you need an I-thou relationship. And that feeds in something that Vasubandhu says. He famously said in the 20 verses, the unenlightened are unable to know the minds of others and their own minds. The enlightened know the true minds of themselves and the others. So the problem here is that if you have a conscious modality that has an object, then we objectify. In introspection, we objectify ourselves, and in the relationship to the other, we objectify the other. So we do not actually study the mind as mind, but we study an objectified, commodified mind. So I then get some of my inspiration for talking about intersubjectivity I get from the Chan, the Zen Buddhist traditions. There is one of the important points within the tradition is the so-called mind-to-mind transmission. And in Dogen, in his essay Kato, he refers to a famous interaction between Bodhidharma and his disciples, in which Bodhidharma said, in response to what the disciples tell him, you have attained my skin, you have attained my flesh, you have attained my bones, you have attained my marrow. And Dogen interprets this, and this is his creative misreading. He says, you attain me, I attain you. And then he says something which probably we would translate as attaining I-you, attaining you-I. But if you actually take the Chinese grammatical structure, you can also say attaining me's you, or attaining I's, attaining you's me. So, and when I do that experiment, I would like to remind you that this is done by a Japanese in the 13th century, a Japanese scholar, a Buddhist, who is known for intentionally misreading texts. So he's playing with that language in Japanese using Chinese language. So perhaps he actually did say attaining me's you and attaining you's me. Lastly, to get to that intersubjectivity, to get to that point when there is the I and thou, when the I attains the you and the you attains the I, we need a transformation. And within a very famous text by Dogen, this transformation is indicated as from studying the self is forgetting the self. So you have two different modalities, one that objectifies the self, one that forgets the objectifying modality. So about the I and you, I and thou, I get my inspiration here from Nishida Kitaro, and he says in the text called I and thou, the I becomes the I by recognizing the thou becomes the thou by recognizing the I. In the depth of the I is the thou, in the depth of the thou is the I. So what he does here is he actually says that for the I to become self-consciousness, the I needs a self-conscious interlocutor to relate to. And then he also claims that there's a deeper reality below that self-conscious, below the conscious I, that is the modality that allows for intersubjectivity. So this would be the underlying modality that connects I and thou. So, and I would like to thank Robert Shah for talking about the Turing test, so I don't have to. The Turing test was sometimes used to talk about consciousness. Like Robert Scharf, I think it doesn't work to identify consciousness and even less self-consciousness because it focuses on the output. This is an image of the interrogator communicating with a computer and a human respondent. Second test, where the Lovelace test is interesting, actually. While Turing is not interested in the cognitive process, the Lovelace test actually is interested in the cognitive process, less so in the output. The Lovelace test is a test that claims to identify whether or not computers, AI can create. I'm talking about generative AI. And then there is the Voigt-Kampff test. I don't know if you're familiar with Hollywood, especially with the Blade Runner. There are the replicas that are AI, and to figure out who they are, they're doing the Voigt-Kampff test, which tests like a polygraph, actually, for emotional response. So what do we learn from the Turing test? We learn from the Turing test, as Robert Scharf said, it's not a test, actually, it's a game. And Turing was not interested. He actually said, we can't answer the question, can machines think? The chess computer or AlphaGo can beat the test or win the game. The problem is the tester assesses the output, not self-consciousness. And for me, that's why I talk about the Turing test, is it indicates the problem with the third-person approach. So, looking now at the Zen canon, I would like to very quickly get input for a new paradigm. This is a very famous text from the supplements to the records of the transmission of the lamp. It's known as Mountains for Mountains. Mountains are not mountains, mountains are really mountains. And if you look at that, and by the way, the color combination is consistent. Yellow is first person, orange is third person. Usually green and blue is something beyond that, and red is sort of a commonality. So you have a structure. Each of the sentences preceded with a condition. 30 years ago, before I started practicing, I saw that mountains are mountains. Again, the second, a little later, when I had some knowledge, I saw that mountains were not mountains. Now, having reached a state of calm, I saw that mountains are really mountains. The Chinese character that's here translated as really actually means to ripen. And so what is interesting here is that there is 3 different mental states, these 3 different attitudes. And to interpret them, I would like to go to Nishida again. Not that he used that, but he himself actually used those sequences of those 3 liners. He talks about 3 universals, then the 3 bashos, then the 3 worlds. And in a very little known text, he says, in a play we are actors and spectators. He means the play of life. Spectators only have an objective knowledge. Actors are immersed in the action and have only a first-person knowledge. In life, we actually both. We are acting in life. We are never outside of life. Yes, we can pretend to be outside and reflect on life. So, again, he uses the subject-object thing. He says that the first line is sort of objectivity. The second one is subjectivity. The third one is subject and objectivity, which he, for most of his time, and Suzuki interpreted as a mystical experience. I think there's a different way of interpreting it. Dogen's interpretation of the mountains are mountains text, he says he talks about people are outside the mountains, the spectators. Then people inside the mountains are the actors. They have the subjective experience that is central to human consciousness. But then the subject and object, the point where we are subject and yet object, is actually in the relationship to other people. It's in intersubjectivity. It's under the body becomes the place which is both subject and object at the same time in relationship to others. And there is one more. In the Fascicle Dotoku, which is translated as expression, Dogen talks about and interprets those mind-to-mind transmission between masters and disciples. But then he says, I and other engage in liberative practices. He and other engages in liberative practices. In me there is expression and non-expression. In him there is expression and non-expression. In the way there is self and other. In the non-way there is self and other. I could talk for hours about it. I won't do that. But there are two important observations. Firstly, he finds it necessary now to talk about four persons. I, my other, he, and his other. And secondly is that, and that gets to what Robert Scharf said, that our perspective, the human experience is always perspectival. So it means we get something and we don't get something. So in everything that we say, we get a point, but we also do not get a point. And this is very central, is that there is no one-fits-all theory. There are multiple theories, and this is where the fourth person comes in. So why the fourth person? My inspiration for that is not only East Asian Buddhist philosophy, it's also linguistics. Ainu language, Ainu, the language of the indigenous people in Japan, and other indigenous languages like Askaloid languages, Yoruba, Ojibwe, where I come from, in the central United States, have a fourth person pronoun, or at least obviative markers that function as fourth person pronoun. A fourth person pronoun is a multiplicity of third person singulars. You have multiple he's and she's. It's the other from the perspective of the third person. That's exactly actually what Dogen talked about. For example, if you have the sentence, he beats him, it's not my example, he and him are two different third persons. So, and actually the Ainu language has a different personal pronoun for that second, third person. And another inspiration is Toyoma Shigehiko, who wrote a book, The Fourth Person Pronoun, and he says, he's a linguist, he says the fourth person pronoun are persons outside the context and persons challenging the context that provide the first, second, and third person. So I can talk about it more if there are questions. So the principle of the fourth person approach is it's multi-perspectival, multiplicity of subjective perspectives. And so what is my first person approach is? So first person is when when a subject posits the world, so it's my experience. Third person is when I'm posited by an impersonal observer. We can talk about the paradox of assuming that scientists or that observers don't have a self. But anyway, so then the second person is when we have that emotional relationship underlying that positionality. And the fourth person is when you have multiple positionalities, multiple emotional connection, multiple second-person relationship, when we are in context, in a wider context. And that gets me to rethinking mind studies. And so in some sense, I'm now getting to a complex theory of consciousness. On one level, we have problem-solving neural networks. Then we have embodied intentionality, which are enacted, where the embodied consciousness self reaches out to a world. We have the embodied intersubjectivity. There is no disembodied intersubjectivity. And we have embodied environmental awareness. So what I call problem-solving neural networks do is they problem solve. They have intelligence. Again, already in the 80s, I had problems with beating chess computers. Now I have no chance, right? And intentionality is a lived positionality where I define my place in the world. Embodied subjectivity has emotion and empathy. You also have the mutual emotion response. That's a text from the Buddhist canon, from Tiantai, but also from the Zen tradition. And the embodied environmental awareness is the expression that Dogen talks about. So we have four different structures. The problem-solving network functions on the input-output structure. The black box is not of interest. The embodied intentionality has the structure of subject and object. The intersubjectivity has the structure of I and thou. And that's a mouthful. The embodied environmental awareness is that the totality is expressed by a multiplicity, and the multiplicity is expresses the totality. But more so, every individual one of the many also expresses every individual one of the other many. Voila, we have intrasnet. And the third-person approach helps us understanding those neural networks. The first-person approach helps us to understand the embodied intentionality or the enacted mind. The second-person approach helps us understand embodied intersubjectivity. The fourth-person approach helps us understand embodied environmental awareness. And if I had another 20 minutes, I could talk about a method that comes out of that. So if you just talk about chess computers, the Turing test imitation game works. If you want to talk about whether or not generative AI is creative, then you can use the Lovelace test. But even the Voigt-Kampf test is a third person because the idea is that the tester can be replaced, that the results are always the same, that there's no input of the tester, him or her or themselves. The test for the embodied intentional mind is what I call the Vasubandhu-Husserl test, because it follows the threefold reduction. It starts with Husserl bracketing our assumption, but then goes straight into Vasubandhu, looking at using the Trisvabhava, the self-natures, as we're looking at the object, that we think that we objectively know, we realize it's interdependently constituted, posited by the subject, and then hopefully, if we are mindful and meditatively aware enough, we get to a reality below that subject-object distinction that Vasubandhu calls parinispana, the ultimate reality. I have two more tests, and then I'm done for the autonomy and reciprocity test is a test in which people respond to each other. The ironic part on me wanted to call it the Koyama-Freud test, because it would be the autonomy and reciprocity text deals with double contingency, with the idea that I conceive of myself differently than others, and we realize that in interactions, every couples therapist knows about that our conception of ourselves is different from the other people's perception. The second step is to deal with transfer and with the emotional interaction, with the emotional connectedness, but then hopefully the goal is what Dawkins calls casting off self and other. And last but not least, is the autonomy in the living world test, in which we theoretically, and this is, again, I could call the Buddha's mind test. This is when we were to understand all the perspective from those very subjective perspectives. Imagine, I was told there are 300 people in this room. Imagine that you see the world through all those 300 perspectives at the same time. For us, it's confusing. It is for Buddha, it's enlightenment, and it would give us a map of where we are, of who we are, and it would give us the awareness of us within the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.